I'm just going to begin our conversation today by introducing the Kirti Collective. For those of you who are new to this conversation series, Kirti Collective is a group of scholars committed to building public dialogue on history, politics, and culture. We came together in the middle of the pandemic to think about regions and places. Our attempt has been to move beyond the academic community and speak to the larger public sphere. And in this attempt, we've published two sets of public articles posted by the News Minute and the Wire. We also intend to work with various languages of the Deccan in the coming few years. In this series, the Deccan Conversations, we are bringing together several new scholars who are working on the region. We began on 15th April with Dr. Hima Bindu's talk, where she discussed the Telugu periodicals and linguistic networks in the princely state of Hyderabad. Our second talk was by Pramod Mandade, who discussed the complex politics of memorialization of quote-unquote integration of Hyderabad in the Marathwada region. The third talk was by Dr. Shashi Kiran, who spoke from his PhD work on Telugu print cultures of Madras Presidency. We also had Namrata Kanchan, who spoke on Deccani literary canons, and we then later had Indivar speak on politics, property, and planning in global Hyderabad. Our last talk was by Firdaus Soni, where she spoke on the Malegaon Jatra and thinking about the region through fairs. Our current talk that we are all here for today is by William Bamber, titled Global Goods in the Deccan, Retracing Hyderabadi Links with the Middle East Through Consumption. Before I introduce Dr. Bamber, I'd like to thank Dr. Sara Wahid for agreeing to be a discussant in the talk. Sara has been an advisor for Kirti since we began, and but also Sara is also a historian who teaches in the University of South Carolina. She's a cultural historian who specializes on South Asian Islam in global and local contexts across the India-Pakistan divide. Her approach to the past is trans-regional and comparative, and her scholarship broadly speaks to issues of religion and secularism, colonialism and nationalism, and gender and memory. Her first book was titled Hidden Histories of Pakistan, Censorship, Literature, and Secularism in Late Colonial India. She's currently working on her second book, In Search of Chand Bibi, Muslim Warrior Queen of India. She'd in fact written a little piece for us as well for the News Minute series that we did. In 1595, Chand Bibi of Deccan Sultanates in southern India defeated the most powerful forces of her time, Mughal imperial armies. And this is the subject of Sarah's upcoming book. On to William. William is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. He's a global historian specializing in the history of the Ottoman Middle East and South Asia, and he's graduated from a PhD in interdisciplinary Near and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Washington in 2022, having previously also studied at the Sabancı University in Istanbul. He's been published in the International Journal of Fashion Studies and awarded ACLS, SSRC, and CLIR grants. So without further ado, I'd invite William to take over and tell us about this global history of the Deccan that I'm really looking forward to. Over to you, William.
All right, thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for turning up today, and particularly to Swati and Yamini for inviting me and organizing this, and Sarah for kindly agreeing to comment on whatever I'm about to say.
William, can I request you to turn on your video, please?
Yes. See if I can do this. Fortunately, Zoom made me install a new set of updates right before I turned on. It seems to have caused some trouble. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, we can see the PowerPoint. Yes, we can see you now.
So, Right. So I'm going to be talking today about the history of links between the Ottoman Middle East and the Deccan region over a period, quite a long period from the 15th century up until the end of the 19th. First of all, I'm going to give kind of a general overview of how those links developed over that long period, how they were kind of composed, and then towards the end, I want to concentrate a little more on some questions of transnational consumption, especially in the 19th century, and how they contributed to the kind of reconfiguration of links between the Deccan and the Ottomans at that time. Now, I think if we talk about the global Deccan or global Hyderabad today, perhaps the first associations that spring into people's mind will be, how the city has developed in the last decade or two into becoming this kind of, really global, teeming metropolis. This sort of huge expansion it's had. You've got the IT corporations, the IT sector, shopping malls and the glittering skyscrapers out west. And maybe the flip side of that a little bit is that, the associations of the Deccan prior to that time had become a little bit more that it was maybe a quieter place, a little more inland, or possibly a little bit insular, far from the cosmopolitan metropolises of, Bombay or Calcutta on the coastlines. I think Sarah said the other day that some people have uncharitably called it India's flyover country, which is, of course, both unkind and inaccurate. And I think that, looking at the longer history of interaction with the Ottoman Middle East that the Deccan has really helps to dispel some of those associations. And, seeing, how this long history has evolved and how rich it's been, illustrates nicely how far Hyderabad is in many ways only the latest chapter and the latest configuration in that long history of global engagement that Hyderabad and the Deccan has. So when we're talking about how Hyderabad and the Deccan has been integrated into broader sort of regional or global contexts outside South Asia in the period before independence, I think there are usually two kinds of stories which are told about that. And the first of them in the early modern period, maybe a little more academic, but still I think very useful, is the idea of the Persian cosmopolis. And this basically is the idea that for a very long period of several centuries, historians being historians, they still argue about when exactly it starts and finishes and where it extended to. But certainly, coming up to the end of the 18th century, you have this very wide geography encompassing South Asia, Central Asia, Iran, sort of the Indian Ocean world as well, and to some degree also the Ottoman Middle East, which is sort of intimately linked together through this shared Persian language culture of letters, of literary production, ideas, and sort of courtly manners and diplomacy. And this is, I think, proved to be a very useful way of thinking about the region as a whole and the sort of important cultural and political continuities it has over this period, even as various different states and, empires sort of expand and contract and appear and disappear within it over that long time. Perhaps just one issue is that, when the curtain does come down quite heavily on that sort of established world of Persianate courts around the turn of the 19th century, it does just, I think, contribute a little bit to this sort of sharp break that we perceive in the periodization between this early modern global world, sort of dominated by this sort of these Persianate structures, and then the sort of idea that there's another sort of global phase that starts afresh with the colonialism, the sort of material aspects of imperialism in the 19th century. And that, of course, brings us to the second major narrative of sort of global integration, which is, of course, this sort of great story of the rise of Europe on the global stage, of exploration, domination, trade, conquest, industrializations, and domination of markets and material extraction that we're all very familiar with. And while there is, of course, there have been very many and very powerful critiques, I think especially when we go to the transnational sort of space and perspective, I think there's still quite a strong legacy of that particular narrative, of this idea of the cultural encounter that happens over the 18th and 19th centuries between these European visitors and colonists and conquerors and traders, and these spaces like South Asia, which end up being almost implicitly portrayed as these more sort of insular traditional spaces, which have a sort of passive role maybe in this story. And just a quick illustration we've got in this picture we've got here on the left of the screen. A classic, late 17th century Deccan miniature, one of the first to depict European visitors. Very interesting in itself, showing us, how they were perceived, how they were integrated into the, the art forms, the worldview, the court, etc., etc. The problem being, of course, that this picture and the handful of other ones depicting early European visitors are the ones which have been sort of endlessly picked up by global and art historians, reproduced in books and expeditions, always kind of presenting European travelers as the carriers of the global, the carriers of the modern throughout the, the sort of 18th and 19th centuries, particularly. And I think hopefully looking at the Ottoman case shows us, by contrast, it's very far from having been a, sort of two-way relationship, and it's much more complicated than that. But let's take a look at the, the geography of these connections, first of all. And I think it's fair to say that when we look at, just the sort of composition of this region, the sort of Ottoman heartlands of Anatolia here and the, what's now the Balkans, the provinces of Rumelia, are maybe just a little bit outside the most immediate orbit of this sort of early modern world. The particularly close connections that we see between, for example, Iran, Central Asia, and across South Asia. Nonetheless, it is very well connected in important ways and is very much a part of the sort of known, imagined geography of all of these spaces. In terms of sort of actual physical links between the two, there are three main paths by which sort of trade and migration is happening. First of all, there's the classic Silk Road route, the overland one that goes up through North India, through Afghanistan, and then northeastern Iran into eastern Anatolia. Much more important in terms of the sheer volume of trade and passage is the seaborne one going through the sort of North Indian Ocean, Arabian Sea, and then up into the Persian Gulf. Hormuz in southern Iran is the sort of key trading entrepot for many hundreds of years, from where goods from both east and west coasts of the Deccan were shipped over, and then they would move on to Baghdad, Aleppo, and then on into the sort of Anatolian and Rumelian regions. There's also a third important route which runs up the Red Sea, not, again, having quite so much volume of trade, but particularly important for human migration because of the position of Mecca here on the Red Sea and the huge amount of Hajj traffic that happened from South Asia and the Deccan across the coast and then up here. And very often it wasn't just a question of people going on Hajj and then returning back on the seaborne journey, but this going to Mecca would very often be just the first or the last leg of a much longer journey lasting several years, in which they would journey around this wider region, perhaps trading goods, looking for employment opportunities, or going to various centers of religious learning or other kinds of learning as it might be. And they're facilitated in doing that in terms of the everyday mechanics of travel. There are both mercantile networks, we have sort of ships, camels, and caravanserais running right across here, but in a sort of close connection with those also, there's a sort of, interlinked network of Sufi networks, Sufi lodges, which run right from Anatolia to South Asia. Particularly important, the Naqshbandi and Chishti brotherhoods, but there are many others as well. And that not only provides, a kind of basis, a sort of superstructure of shared social and spiritual culture around the, the veneration of saints, the celebration of saints, making offerings at all of these different sort of places along the way, but a very practical sort of closely connected network of kanakas where people can stay overnight while they're traveling, get some food, and have a bit of safety before they move on the next day. And many of these networks are sort of mutually constitutive of each other. In terms of Deccani Ottoman political connections, they wax and wane a little bit over the long term. We have a sort of rise and fall and rise again in some ways. So the 15th to the mid-16th century is really the high period in many ways of Ottoman-Deccani diplomatic relations. This is a time in which the Deccan Sultanates are very much at the height of their wealth, their power, very much projecting their diplomacy, trade, and goods, and all the rest into the Indian Ocean and further on. From the other side, this is also the very expansionary dynamic phase of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans push into the Iraqi provinces in the late 14th century down to the Hijaz. And then in the early 16th century, we see a concerted attempt by the Ottomans to project their own influence and their own maritime power into the Indian Ocean, including up the west coast of India, in competition with the Portuguese, who were then just arriving as well. So we have a period of quite sustained diplomatic intercourse and contacts between the Bahmanis and then Bijapur and the Ottomans, in various attempts to sort of conduct strategic negotiations, alliances against the Portuguese or other sultanates. And these diplomatic contacts also help strengthen, the movement of trade and military and courtly migration across those two centers as well over this period. And I think one aspect that's particularly sort of interesting and important is not so much the learned scholars here, but Deccani sources of the 15th and early 16th centuries contain numerous references to Ottoman mercenaries, military officials, and engineers. And those Ottoman engineers in particular are thought to be particularly important in the introduction of cannons and firearms to the Deccan, which was, of course, the first region in South Asia to adopt them. This was, the period in which the Ottoman Empire was very much at the forefront of global military technology, and those guys were important in introducing them in the Deccan, where they would go on to be extremely important in the defeat of Vijayanagar in this period by the other sultanates. And you can just see up here, this is a sort of early 16th century sort of tube-style siege cannon from the fort of Bidar, very similar if you've ever seen any pictures of the cannons which are used at the siege of Constantinople in 1453. After that, however, we have a sort of long period where relations really die down a little bit. And it's due to a number of reasons. The Ottomans, basically the foray into the Indian Ocean is very expensive and doesn't really achieve much. And by the middle of the 16th century, we see a concerted, sort of deliberate focus switch away from there to look at the Mediterranean instead. There's also a kind of Ottoman turn away from the sort of Persian as an active courtly culture, which occurs around that time, which again just sort of removes another layer of familiarity in some ways. And on the Deccan side, of course, Mughal expansion begins to chip away at the influence of the Deccan Sultanates as well. At the same time, however, this is what's happening at a sort of top diplomatic or political level. Beneath all of that, we still have trade and migration continuing, throughout this period very healthily. We can just see an illustration here in this 18th century picture. So you can see here, this is a lady selling water pipes, hookahs. We've got, this very diverse crowd here, really speaking to the sort of the diverse population in places like Hyderabad at this time, the cosmopolitan culture, and among all of these other different peoples, we have at the back here these two figures whose, this sort of very large, slightly ropey green and white turbans, very, very similar to what is being worn in Ottoman Empire at this time, almost certainly Ottoman Turks there. So there's then a sort of final phase in some ways, which is starting, I think, from the late 18th and continuing into the 19th century. We have a kind of a rekindling and reworking of sort of intellectual and political relations between the Deccan and the Ottoman Middle East, partly prompted by the common problem of the rise of Europe in this period. And we're going to talk about that in a little more detail in a moment. Beneath this world of politics, probably more important in many ways, is the enormous amount of trade that occurs throughout this period between the Ottoman domains and the Deccan. And while the trade itself is diverse, we do also have some Ottoman goods coming into the Deccan, particularly horses and slaves, some, herbs and olive oil, a few silks and a few other things. But really the dominant feature of the trade between the two is the enormous export of Deccani textiles into Ottoman domains. Now, although there has been a good amount of work on the sort of South Asian Ottoman trade in textiles by Ottoman scholars, a lot of it doesn't really differentiate between regions. So we don't really have a sense of the exact sort of quantitative volume that is coming from the Deccan itself. However, there are many references in the sources of that time, which leave us in no doubt as to the relative importance of Deccani textiles within that trade. So for example, in a 1640 price index for the Istanbul market, listing all of the imported cloth, we have prominent mentions of very large amounts of fabric from Hyderabad, from Varangal, and from Masulipatam as well. And again, the Ottoman taste, in fact, Ottoman sultans complained it was an addiction to South Asian textiles, long predates the sort of 18th century European craze for chintzes. It's estimated that in 1690, Ottoman imports of South Asian cloth were at least 5 times those of Europe as a whole. And you can see here in these illustrations here, the textiles that were coming in from the Deccan, from South Asia, were very much these luxury items, exotic goods, items which were coveted, would be paraded as sort of prominent examples of personal consumption, cosmopolitanism. We can see in the picture of this dancing girl on the right, she's wearing a whole variety of Indian fabrics, or at least very close, if not then very close Ottoman imitations of Indian fabrics as sometimes happen. Fine muslins here, these floral prints that she's got on her jubbe, and then we can see some clear examples of chintz and the hanging things of this inner waist strap, possibly also her gown. And I think this is probably, the striped fabric here is likely to be Gujarati Kutna fabric as well. And this would be, this is a sort of image of the social scene of early 18th century Istanbul. This is people going to socialize, show themselves off and promenade in these parks on the banks of the Bosphorus. And people would absolutely be showing off the latest fashions, of which South Asian fabrics were a key and important part. I think we can see quite a few quite South Asian looking sort of boaty print style things in many of the figures we see here. But it's important to remember as well, this huge movement of fabrics from mostly the Deccan to the Ottoman domains, it's not only important in economic terms, but it was a really, a key part of the way that these two regions were connected together and how they thought about and imagined each other in a period before, maps and that sort of cartographic imagination, which was so habituated now, was really a thing. We've got a couple of illustrations here that just show that a little bit. So on the left, this is a ceiling painting showing some courtiers from 15th century Vijayanagar, from Philip Wagner's very influential article showing how the courtiers, or the court, the elites there, during that time, kind of abandoned these older and more traditional forms of South Indian Indic dress and really adopted these much more kind of Middle Eastern, more Arab style kaba and these sort of kulaya or kulas, this tall conical caps as well. And this was very much part of a process of, these guys showing that they were a part of this, very wealthy, very cultured, cosmopolitan Indian Ocean world of trade, of social contact, social movement and diplomacy, and that they were as, au fait with all of the conventions, the social conventions and the taste of it as anyone else. it's also, this picture is, I think, interesting. We can also see already here in the 15th century many sort of key elements of the sort of superstructure of dress construction and fashion, which we can see continuing in some respects right through to the end of our period in the 19th century. If you look at the long sleeves we have here, the long length of these robes, very typical of Deccani fashion, even later on. The waist ties and these sort of tall caps we have as well, loose from the waist, but sort of more tailored around the arms and the chest. This is extremely typical of what we find later on. And you can see this, this sort of elements, this fold down collar here, absolutely typical of Turkic fashion and Turkic dress. And in fact, the one that I'm wearing here today, and doubtless a few of you as well, they're cousins of the ones we see here, because those also come from European adoption of Ottoman fashions later on in the 17th century. And then just quickly here on the right, we have a 17th century kalamkari rumar, again, just speaking to the importance of fashion in sort of denoting different imaginations of the region of geography and sort of cultured mastery of that world of goods beyond one's own sort of sphere of life. And we have all of these different figures here. Their dresses showing that they're coming from different places, from China, from Ottoman Turkey. There's some Persians and others around as well. And we also have this whole sort of world of goods, of food, of wine, china, other sort of luxurious goods, showing how much the sort of knowledge of these, how much they circulated for one thing, but how much the knowledge of them was, a sort of integral part of showing how you were global and sophisticated, and how much it was part of the good life at that time. So if we move forward a bit and come to this late 18th century period, this is when we begin to see sort of beginnings of a new, slightly reconfigured engagement across these two centers, across the Deccan and the Ottoman Empire. We see this in a couple of places. First of all, in the renewed diplomatic contacts. For example, we have the emissaries sent by Tipu Sultan to Ottoman Istanbul, requesting military help against the British at the end of the 18th century. But we also have a sort of appearance and steady increase in production of illustrated works, sort of encyclopedic works on the world, which take a particular interest in these countries in both contexts. So, we can see in these two figures here, this is an Ottoman manuscript. This is Fazıl Enderuni's Hubanname from the 1790s originally. This is his imagination of an Indian boy, and not coincidentally, it doesn't look like anything like an Indian boy, really. I mean, it's a very sort of strange figure in some ways, but there is a good amount of the really accurate part of it is in the textiles and the clothes that he's wearing. You can see in the shawls and the printed pajamas there. And this is supposedly Muhammad Ali Pasha from an early 19th century Hyderabadi Maraka. Probably this is a repurposed picture. It bears no resemblance to him, but still the caption that this is Muhammad Ali Pasha, the ruler of Egypt, province of the Ottoman Empire, shows a sort of deeper re-engagement, I think. And these are patterns that we find undergoing sort of very rapid intensification towards the end of the 19th century. And the 1870s was really the key period in which we see the sort of the importance of Deccani Ottoman connections kind of catching light again. And this is due to a number of different factors. 1870s sees a whole kind of big bang of globalization enabled by new technologies and new infrastructures. This is when we get steamships appearing, railways start rolling out across South Asia, including particularly I think is it 1883, the Hyderabadi rail connection, thereabouts anyway, and also the telegraph, which relays news and information in a period of hours, where before it would have taken weeks. So the speed of transportation, the ease of transportation is suddenly transformed. And at the same time, we have lithography and photography sort of transforming the visualization of different geographies and different peoples at this time. And a key event in terms of Ottoman-Deccani relations is the 1877-78 Russo-Turkish War, which in many ways is the first global media event to happen in South Asia. This is the first one where there's sort of daily bulletin updates through the telegraphic post. This is just after, vernacular papers, like we can see a page from Avad Akbar here on the right, make these sort of, much more narrative, much more realistic pictures and accounts available to people. And it's incredibly exciting. This sort of being able to follow this Ottoman conflict in real time, as it seems, is sort of, a real sign of modernity to the people who were there at the time. And, you can see this sort of doesn't look like much to us today in the era of, Netflix and IMAX perhaps, but in the 1870s, it was tremendously exciting to be able to see these kinds of war scenes reproduced, in the local papers. And similarly, we have, images of the Ottoman sultans coming out in all kinds of new sort of illustrated, sort of cheap books at that time as well. Really giving a whole new sort of generation a much more comprehensive and much more sort of realist image of what the Ottomans looked like and who they were than ever before. And of course, in the context like this, very much in a kind of heroic light as well. Perhaps it's not surprising then that by the end of the 1870s, we start to see very strong influences of Ottoman contemporary fashion in Hyderabadi dress. And, I think if you look at, this is the Ottoman Sultan Abdulaziz here, in the sort of classic 19th century sort of Istanbulite gentleman's dress of the plain or dark colored Istanbuli jacket and fez. And then we've got a picture of a couple of, I think, Hyderabadi officials, again, from the sort of probably early 1880s or so here. And you can immediately see the likeness in this sort of general outline and silhouette. And we've even got, the local Deccani imagination of punch here. This is the Deccan punch. He's also wearing exactly the same outfit. Why is it that an Ottoman fashion suddenly becomes popularized in Hyderabad in the 1870s and 1880s? There are a couple of things going on. First of all, this is within the context of British imperial consolidation now under the Crown, and this sort of, the quandary of modernization in some ways that amid all of the sort of critiques of the old court lifestyle, the Mughal dress and so on, how does one become, modern? How does one present oneself as sort of modernized in a way which doesn't involve just aping European dress and becoming these sorts of craven, self-abnegating imitators? Well, the Ottomans in some ways provide a sort of alternate inspiration, for the reinvention of Hyderabad in this period. Of the invention of Hyderabadi style. I mean, lest we forget, this is a very delicate period in Hyderabadi history. It's been the end of the Mughal Empire. It leaves a huge sort of gap in the, the aesthetics, the image, the iconography of the Nizamate. There's a child Nizam on the throne. Salah Jang is there as regent. So in many ways, this provides a sort of useful way of, reimagining the aesthetics, reimagining the sort of global importance of the Nizamate at that time without having to resort to imperial imagery. And in fact, within a decade or two, we find again a further movement in this fashion, in which it becomes, again, actually less Ottoman and much more, distinctively Deccani. You can see here in these pictures, these are all sort of studio photographs from around the sort of late 1880s, early 1990s. We can still see that it's the sort of, the sort of rough structure of the sort of Ottoman Istanbuli, Shirvani, as it became in Hyderabad at that time, and the fez, but it's very much moved away in interesting ways from this sort of very dark and sober aesthetic. Going back to regional Deccani fabrics. So we can see, Himru here handloom fabrics, handloom sherwanis became very important again as kind of an expression of that regional character and Hyderabadi regional particularism, not only against the British, of course, but also against the sort of, the North Indian sort of proto-nationalist claims to pan-Indian cultural hegemony and sort of political primacy, which are also emerging in North India in this time. And, at the same time, we also have, this is a way of, I think, and I'm going to wrap it up with this, I think, this is a way by which, during this process of kind of reimagining and reinventing, Hyderabadi identity and the identity of the Nizamate as well during this period at the end of the 19th century, that they were able to kind of draw and invoke this new kinds of global knowledge, and particularly, the Ottomans, who are this, this empire were fighting the Russians, fighting the good fight against imperialism, one of the last places not to have been formally colonized by Europe by this time. But at the same time, making it their own, using their own fabrics. And when we look closely at Hyderabadi sherwanis, and that you can see here, not only are they sort of extremely, proudly colorful and boldly patterned, very much in the tradition of earlier styles of Hyderabadi dress and male aesthetics, again, kind of going back to that sort of proud courtly tradition and reinventing it for the modern era. But we can also see sort of material continuities as well, both with Ottoman dress and with earlier Deccani styles. So we still have the sort of, this interior crossover, very reminiscent of the Jama and the Angarka. And the importance of that is that really for both Ottomans and Deccanis, the most objectionable parts of European male style, European clothes generally, were the tight trousers and the tight collars. And the Istanbuline and the Sherwani were garments which basically managed to allow them to look modern, to be able to sort of present themselves as sort of smart, professional, ready for the office, ready for the college, but in ways which allowed them to still be comfortable, and if necessary, still mix in those old, more traditional spaces where you had to sit on the floor and perhaps, observe different social patterns as well. So what this tie allows is when you sit down, it continues to shield your legs from anyone seeing them, which means that you can wear loose pajamas or shalwar underneath. It would also often, because it was always worn buttoned right up to the neck, you would be able to get away very often without wearing anything except a vest underneath. And therefore you get away from having to wear a starched collar or anything like that, or having anything, a too tightly tailored shirt underneath it. So I'll leave it there, but I think what we see with this, just to bring it back to where we started, with these sort of very innovative, in fact, very creative expressions of sort of cosmopolitan, worldly Hyderabadi modernity that we see at the end of the 19th century. I think it really pushes back against this idea of, the colonial cultural encounter, and that there was this kind of two-way struggle between the political and the aesthetic traditions that we find in the Deccan or in South Asia, and these sorts of new, more modernizing mass-produced ones that were brought in by colonialism. In fact, we see here how these guys are really drawing creatively on all of the possibilities which are opened up by this sort of material globalization of the late 19th century, drawing on these Ottoman styles, the idea of the Ottomans as these other kind of independent cultured guys across the water who've held off European colonization, modernizing on their own terms. But we can see in this picture, we've still got the sort of Mughal swords, we've still got the slippers. It's a very distinctive and uniquely regional Deccani take on late 19th century global modernity. Thanks.
Thanks, William.
Thank
Sarah,
you so
over
much.
to you.
Swati, did you want to say anything before we?
No, I was just saying over to you, Sarah. Also, William, if you could just stop sharing, then I could spotlight both of you. Yeah.
Vanish.
Thank you. Thank you for this really wonderful talk. And I really appreciated this long overview of trade and the circulation of goods and commodities, especially with the links that you draw between the Ottoman world and the Deccan right through the 15th century and into the 19th. And I was particularly interested, I mean, there's a lot of things going on here. And of course, as you rightly point out, you're pushing back against both, on the one hand, this dominant narrative of the encounter between Europe and India as being the only one, rather, that we have to kind of think about, right? This two-way struggle, as you say, and also sort of thinking more deeply and beyond this kind of sense of the Persian cosmopolis and Persianate culture and society that's shaping, the Deccan from the 15th century onwards. So I have a few questions. You can sort of answer them in any order you like. My first question has to do what got you interested in this particular topic. And then to go along with that, I'm also curious because you showed such wonderful images and you're really drawing a lot from paintings, and I'm really curious about your source material there and the extent to which the kind of analysis you're doing of these paintings differ perhaps from, say, art historians, whom you briefly mentioned, but I'd like to sort of hear more about the differences between the way you're reading this material and, say, what art historians would be doing.
Oh, thank you very much. So in answer to where did it come from? So I think some time ago now, I did my master's in Istanbul, Turkey, and Ottoman history back in the day, looking, I think, back then at sort of urbanization of Istanbul in the 19th century and so on. And I think I came across, I was already going through archives of old photographs and things, both in British Library and so on, and also online. And I eventually found out that a whole series of images that I'd assumed the Ottoman bureaucrats were in fact South Asians from the late 19th century, from Aligarh as it happened. And then the more I pursued this, the more, the more kind of links I found in some ways. And in a way, it's sort of this whole question of, in this period where everything is supposed to be about Westernization. There goes my video again. About Westernization, this is what the whole debate is about. Suddenly, in the middle of it all, we have this Ottoman, this huge Ottoman transnational fashion, because it's in fact not only South Asia. We see this kind of, fez and Sherwani aesthetic appearing across, a much wider geography, in fact, including sort of Southeast Asia and North Africa and, parts of Iran and Central Asia as well. So it sort of presented itself as kind of an interesting and different story of globalization that's happening in what is nominally the age of imperialism. And then, by pursuing that further, I eventually, I think came to Hyderabad for various reasons as a place where it really took on its own sort of story further on, in a way that we see it really evolving in Hyderabad as just sort of one influence in the reinvention of the idea of what it meant to be a cosmopolitan Hyderabadi within the context of imperialism at the end of the 19th century. And this particularly, I think, I wasn't able to get into this too much, and it's hard to find much information about it, but this is the period when you start to see, just when this fashion appears in Hyderabad, it's also exactly the time where you see this elaboration of this new sort of Deccani idea of Hyderabadi identity, which is sort of pushing back against the sort of North Indian, Pan-Indian thing, and sort of bringing back in the idea of sort of Qutb Shahis as a sort of cultural heritage rather than, or as much as, the Mughals. And, so there's this sort of craft revival movements and things which all sort of tie in around that time. In terms of the source material, I do a lot of it from pictures, and I was very fortunate to be able to find some surviving examples of late 19th century Sherwanis and fezes and other dress as well, both in Hyderabad and some museums in London and things as well. Insofar as, differing from art historians, I'm not very good at art history, so I necessarily can't see all the nuances and things that art historians are able to. And to some degree, that's true of dress and fabric as well. Although I find that the more time you spend with it, it's something that really gives back. The more details you notice, the more you look at the stitching and so on. But I think partly that, it just seems that art historians don't really look at non-high art. So the major difference was just that I don't think there have been many people looking at the sort of bad art from the late 19th century and seeing what that tells us about, what people were thinking, what kinds of connections that we see. And, it's there really that we often find, I think, a lot of the stories, a lot of, the connections that we, which are there, which are not, the ones being bought up by European collectors and things and so on, and, which appear in all the museums and so on later on.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm also really intrigued also because, there has tended to be this very North-centric approach to understanding Muslim elite political engagement with the Ottoman Turkish sort of, erstwhile empire by the early 20th century through that Khilafat movement. And a lot of work has been produced around those kinds of and you touch upon this alternative modernity that's being crafted as the non-European, non-British imperialism. Instead of looking towards looking towards the Ottomans, right? That's being crafted here. So there has been this sense that somehow that happens really just in the 20th century. And I guess I would sort of perhaps ask you to what extent and how, what sort of the story you've told about the cultural and aesthetic refashionings and transformations that are going on, especially in the 1870s and 1880s, as you mentioned. Tell us about politics and tell us about the relationship between the Ottomans and the Deccan in particular, but also South Asia more broadly.
So, again, in some ways it's difficult because, the Deccan is very little studied in this period, and what material there is tends to be, very good, but often quite old at this point. Most of the work that is done on Ottoman South Asian connections is, of course, around this sort of, Khilafat movement, pan-Islamic connections, and particularly, actually, there's a lot of, excellent, very rich stuff on the sort of reformist Islamic internationalism that really starts to pick up. And of course, we know all about this in the early 20th century and begins to shape the sort of beginnings of Muslim nationalism in South Asia. Please forgive my video turning off every 2 minutes.
Oh, that's fine.
Bugs in the updates, I think. But again, I think, in terms of politics, South Asia is, of course, very much in the Ottoman thinking at this time, particularly, the political level from 1877. Sorry, I hope you don't mind if I just talk. I'm fighting a losing battle.
That's totally fine, yes.
So Abdul Hamid is the guy, of course, who really creates an explicit political project of Pan-Islam, because as the Caliph, he's trying to leverage the, what he hopes will be the allegiances of all of South Asia's millions of Muslims in his diplomacy, his own diplomacy with the British. Of course, he's not particularly successful in, really achieving that leverage that he wants to. And, as various people have shown, that, there is a great deal of sort of emotional attachment to the Caliphate and to the Ottomans in South Asia. He's more successful in raising money from it. So one of the thing that we find most common in the Ottoman archives in this period regarding Hyderabad is he's endlessly sending medals to the most generous donors. So all of the Salajangs get whatever it is, the Medal of Osman First Class or whatever for donating X amount to the the Russian war effort. And again, this happens all over again in World War I. But I tend to, I think especially in the case of Hyderabad, it's important to differentiate it from the sort of the development of that kind of Muslim nationalist leadership and sort of intellectual formation that we have around sort of Aligarh and North India, which is beginning in the late 19th century as well. And because, I think even the Khilafat movement isn't really it's not nearly such a thing in Hyderabad. And Hyderabad kind of starts defining itself against those guys in many ways, partly by saying, we're by promoting regional identity, Deccani regional identity over communal identity, saying, of course, the Ganga Germany thing, we don't care, Hindu, Muslim. But dress plays in a big part in that, because not only do these Hyderabadi guys in their sherwanis and fezes, which are now bright and colorful, made out of himlu and other fabric, look completely different to these North Indian social reformists, Aligarh, who are very much in the sort of very dark, very serious, very studious, very pious and sort of, textually oriented. But sorry, lost my train of thought for a moment.
That's fine. That's fine. No, I mean, it's really fascinating what you've looked at here. And there's also this tendency to see the Sherwani as quintessentially Hyderabadi in terms of it being, the idea that sort of Hyderabad has its own identity, and yet where are those other cultural influences coming from? So rather than seeing sort of culture as this static phenomenon, sort of the way in which your talk is bringing about how it's really an outcome, right, of this various kinds of goods and also expressions that you're mapping out really through these, through paintings, through images. So I really, really appreciated that. And of course, there's lots of other questions that I'm happy to ask, but I want to hand it over to those in the audience and everyone else who's attended the talk to ask questions to William about this, about these Ottoman connections to the Deccan.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Sure.
I just remembered what it was I was going to finish with, which is, of course, the other way in which Resin Shirvani becomes this sort of symbol of reconfigured Hyderabadi Deccani identity, is this thing that you can't tell what religion someone is when they're wearing it. It becomes a completely regional sort of uniform of the new Hyderabadi state and city.
So would anyone else like to ask some questions here or pose them in the chat, and I'm happy to field them?
I think Eric has a question. Eric, please go ahead.
Yes, Eric.
Hi there, everyone. Thanks. I wanted to, first of all, I wanted to congratulate William on this excellent talk. Really enjoyed hearing about this work that I've read and seen and heard about before, but in a presentation. Very, very nice work, and a great discussion as well. I wanted to ask a couple of different questions. One of them picks up on something that Sarah mentioned already, and one of them kind of goes in a somewhat different direction. The first is this question of what we might call pan-Islamism or Muslim internationalism or whatever. And I just wanted to hear a little bit more about this, because yes, I think certainly one thing that we see in Hyderabad during this era of the Khilafat movement and even the late 19th century is an attempt to kind of chart out an independent track for the state that does not necessarily, and this becomes increasingly the case later on, that doesn't necessarily fit within the kind of framework that gets laid out by the Muslim League and kind of leading Indian Muslim nationalists and so forth. But I wanted to hear, and I think part of what's going on in Hyderabad are attempts to sort of forge connections with other Muslim places in the world, such as up until kind of after World War I, the Ottoman world, as well as its legacies. And I wanted to ask, and we still see this, we still see the kind of fezes come out at major moments that are connected to the sort of celebration of the regime of the Nizams and Muslim sovereignty in Hyderabad. So I guess I wanted to ask, in your work, do you see traces where people draw explicit connections between use of Ottoman styles and textiles and the popularity of Hyderabadi things in the Ottoman world, and this idea of Hyderabad solidifying these connections. The other question I had is another one that's sort of related to a very different kind of nationalism, and that's the question of Swadeshi. When, of course, we have a massive push in South Asia led by Congress nationalists to consume only domestically produced goods, and which this might also extend to styles as well. And I wanted to hear, what contact, tensions, resonances do you see within the work that you've looked at between sort of the Swadeshi movement and the kind of trends that you're examining here? Thanks.
Thank you. Great questions. So I think with reference to a couple of the things you've asked, one thing that sort of strikes me, I think there's a big difference, like a lot changes in Hyderabad and in South Asia as a whole between the late 19th century and the early 20th century. The politics, the tone of the politics really changes. And I think, in those are the decades in which, there's a lot of sort of consolidation of those pan-Islamic or sort of Muslim reformist networks across the geography of sort of South Asia and Egypt and, so on, which become consolidated, which go on to become influential. But I think like what I see when I look at the sort of 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and perhaps I should say I'm really looking at fashion, so I'm perhaps not as well up on the other stuff as some other people might be, but people do have this very strong emotional connection to the Ottomans, very strong interest that comes with the sort of new connections and new information that sort of turns up in the 1870s, but it doesn't always fit very comfortably at all with the kind of textbook idea of pan-Islam, that this is political action being motivated by attachment to the institution of the Caliph, or the sort of the authority of the Caliph, and the British attacks on that. It seems much more that this is just sort of one quite often loosely defined, quite amorphous sort of ingredient in how people are sort of engaging with these the tremendous globalization that they're living through in these decades, in which the fabric of the city is being transformed. There's these like new kinds of media, of consumption goods appearing every day. I mean, for people living in Hyderabad in 1890, things look, maybe comparable to today in some ways, unimaginably different from 20 or 30 years previously. And that's also something which is, both tremendously exciting to people and also, maybe not frightening, but kind of disturbing. Things are being lost, things are changing. And so we see a lot of the sort of local social politics in Hyderabad sort of growing up, developing around these changes as well. So the whole, so one example of that is the mulki, non-mulki politics, which also becomes very prominent at this time. And I think partly what I see happening with this move away from the sort of much more explicitly Ottoman, the very dark, very sober, very businesslike black Sherwanis that sort of first appear, and the much more, bold Deccani ones, it's all of these North Indian guys who are coming down from mostly Aligarh and, taking over the administration in that period. And it's kind of a sort of a movement against those guys and what they stand for to some degree as well, coming down and doing that. And the excitement that people have about what's happening in the Ottomans, or the sense of connection they feel, it's also to do, there's no doubt there's a strong element of sort of anti-imperial solidarity, empathy as well. And this really comes out with the Russo-Turkish War in 1877. People are partly, I think, wearing this costume. It's a way of not invoking their Muslimness necessarily, or sort of, it's not an inherently Islamic dress. There are plenty of like angry old guys writing tracts in 1880 who'll tell you exactly what Islamic dress looks like, and it's not this. But it speaks to a sort of modern reimagining of global identity, in which that is perhaps an element. That this is, how you can fit in the sort of modern global world and still sort of, feel comfortable that you're a part of that older world of, that older geography and the associations that you have with, the religious centers of the Middle East, or that sort of Islamic or Persian culture. And, for different people, it might be different. This is just, I think how a lot of people sort of participated in this excitement of modernity without, dressing up in suits. And then, sorry, the second question you asked was about, I think, Swadeshi and the sort of boycott movement, if that's right. And as far as that goes, I think I'm not sure about the early 20th century. I kind of, my work kind of stops quite suddenly around 1900. But where we do see it is that there is definitely a craft revival movement that happens in Hyderabad through the 1880s and 1890s as well, which is also happening there in North India. And I think that all is sort of feeding into the set of ideas about, how imperialism and colonialism is sort of, wrecking the sort of domestic production, crafts and, products and so forth. There's various factories being founded, and this is explicitly linked by the Shirvani. Both Salajang II is very important in championing, if you're going to wear a Shirvani, wear it with local fabric. Abid, I think, also has, when that's first built, there's sort of very strong emphasis on come and get your tailored Shirvani in local Hyderabadi fabric, support your local state, support your local economy, etc., etc. But I think to a lot of people, they're more excited about having being able to afford more and more exciting global goods. So yes, I don't know exactly about Swadeshi, I guess.
Eric, did you want to respond to that, or did you have any other questions, or do others have questions? Happy to field the questions. I mean, on Eric's point, I'm fascinated by partly the ways in which these have changed, right, with this Muslim pan-Islamic, and or the way in which the contemporary. So, for instance, when you see Ertugrul, the very popular Turkish drama series that re-narrates the rise of the Ottoman Empire from a very sort of contemporary Turkish nationalist perspective, and that it's resonating, right, with Muslim populations in Pakistan, but also in Hyderabad. And so, you have these eateries now, or drugstores named Ertugrul in
really?
Hyderabad. Yeah, I saw them in Karachi as well. But I think the impulse, that impulse is much more, I don't think it's related as in terms of what you're speaking of, this period from the, this long kind of overview from 15th century, and especially even in the 19th century. This is a new kind of phenomenon, although of course it is this exchange, this kind of appreciation or, for Turkish culture, but really it's also being driven by this re-narrating of the Ottoman Empire from a very, a particular kind of, even Islamist politics, right? Which is not what's going on perhaps in the aesthetics of the Sherwani. So when now people are trying to imitate the Ertugrul kind of look, right, that I think is driven by different kinds set of politics that perhaps has more to do with the early 20th century politics that Eric mentioned, but much more, of course, to do with post-colonial and 21st century phenomena. But that's sort of to sort of think about that, both continuities and ruptures, right? So on the one hand, you're telling a story about continuity, and I wonder to what extent that story of continuity, when does that story of continuity kind of end? Because you have certain kinds of realignments in political thinking and in global Muslim identity, and that's being kind of largely circulated, right? So, I mean, in Pakistan, of course, the integral drama series has been promoted by the government, you know. I mean, in Hyderabad, again, you're seeing sort of these amongst Muslims looking towards this broader pan-Islamic identity, and that's happening in various different contexts, like a global circulation, but it also sort of something that's interesting is that it in some ways obscures perhaps this very long history that you're referring to. But yeah, any other questions, comments, thoughts on this really wonderful talk by William?
I think if we don't have any more questions, we could bring this conversation to a close. Thank you, Sarah, for fielding these fantastic questions, and William, thank you very much. We'd actually never thought about the Deccan through fashion, and I mean, as historians of the Deccan, we've looked at Ottoman and Deccan collections more through the political lens. So I thought this was such a gorgeous presentation, and I'm going to be thinking a little bit more about art history and bad art that you spoke about. So I think that's something for us to think about with in terms of how we look at sources. So thank you very much for taking the time out to share your work with us, and we definitely look forward to reading more of your work. So thank you, Sarah, and thank you, William.
Thank you so much as well, all of you.
Thank you very much.
I'm so sorry again about the video issues.
No problem. Thanks for the
There's a
talk.
lot to answer for.
Yeah, no, not at all. And thank you so much for the talk. That was a really wonderful talk. And I'm looking forward to seeing more of your work once it comes out and in print.
Likewise, thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Yes.